Chapter 10 Emperor at Play. Napoleon laid his hand on the shoulder of his confidant, the Grand Marshal, and looked him straight in the face. "Yes, Duroc, war is inevitable." The Grand Marshal said nothing. He watched the Emperor as he walked up and down the room with his hands behind his back. Now and again, in accordance with a trick of his, Napoleon tugged at the scarlet facing of his foot grenadier's uniform. He came to a standstill, took a little oval tortoise-shell snuff box out of his pocket and opened it with one hand. "A pinch, Duroc." The Grand Marshal did not like the snuff, which was not finely enough grated for him, but he took a pinch of it out of politeness and pretended to sniff it up his nostrils. Napoleon, for his part, helped himself to a big pinch, smeared it all over his nose, and scattered grains all around him, sneezed, and went on with his walk. "Yes, my friend, war is inevitable. I might even say that it is essential." "Nevertheless, sire," Duroc objected, boldly, "everybody wants peace." Napoleon studied his old comrade's honest face for a moment or two. He liked Duroc's frizzled hair, growing low down on his forehead, his big nose, proper to a good fellow, his eyes, which were the windows of a soul devoted to his master. "Peace. Nobody wants peace more than I do, but it takes two, or even more, to make peace. I know that it's a hard winter, and there is fear of famine. The people are murmuring," ventured the Grand Marshal. A tawny flash sprang suddenly from Napoleon's eyes. "Are you talking about the recent insurrection? A handful of rebels bribed by the Bourbons. And where did it take place?" "At Caen, a hotbed of insurgents. But I taught them a lesson. 8 executions, and I didn't even spare women. I had to make an example, Grand Marshal. Make an example." Duroc prudently beat a retreat. He looked around him. They were in the map room, next to the Emperor's study. On the table was spread out an immense map of Russia. It was spangled with red-headed and black-headed pens, representing respectively the French forces and the enemy's forces. A compass lay upon it, and all around it stood a score of candlesticks, which had served to light it up during the night. "Sire," said Duroc reproachfully, "you've been spending part of the night here again. You'll tire yourself out." "Yes, we stayed up very late, Daub and I, but you know me, 3 hours of sleep is all I need. We did a good night's work. The two of us got up on the table and lay down on the map to see it better. Daub moved the Russian pens, and I moved the French pens. At one moment, in the heat of action, we banged our heads together." Duroc laughed. "Clumsy fellow, poor Daub. I'll bet he's got a fine lump on his." Napoleon deigned to smile. "I expect so. His head isn't as hard as mine." Then suddenly, in the grip of his great dream again, he banged his fist on the map. "That's where I'm going. That's where I'm going, I say." I'll sign peace at Moscow itself. At Moscow itself, my grand army will go straight to the bear's heart like a sword." Napoleon's lip curled. "He's a knave, that fellow Alexander. He knows I'm having a hard time of it in Spain, and he's taking advantage of it. Let me tell you, Duroc, that ever since Erfurt, the Russian alliance has been falling to pieces, and my marriage finished it off. To be sure, he dallied with me for a time. Why didn't he go and plague the English in India? And what about the Turkish Empire? I'd have given him most of it. He had only to go and take it, leaving Constantinople to me, of course. But he turned up his nose at that, and now he's not friends with France any more. He won't trade with us. Tomorrow he'll be asking me to evacuate Prussia. Such insolence demands punishment, and I've assembled 500,000 men to inflict it on him. You must see that there's no way out but war, Duroc." "But, sire," objected the Grand Marshal, "you can count on Austria's support." Napoleon's mouth drooped bitterly. "Austria? She won't give me any help worth mentioning. Benevolent neutrality, or a few thousand men at the best. My father-in-law is in Metternich's pocket. I've nothing to expect from these people. Of course, not a word about all this to the Empress. I'm not satisfied with her state of health, and she mustn't be worried. You can count on my discretion, sire." "I'm sure I can, Duroc. Meanwhile, we must dismiss depression. I've taken steps to do so. On February 6th, we shall have a great dress ball, and on the night of Shrove Tuesday, a masked ball, whose splendor will long be remembered." At this moment the door opened, and Nezelof came in. "What is it?" demanded Napoleon. "Sire," replied his secretary, "Her Majesty the Empress and His Majesty the King of Rome are awaiting you." His son. Everything else ceased to count for Napoleon. His face lit up. "I'll come at once," he said. Deserting Duroc, he hurried into his study. Hitherto nobody but his secretary had been allowed inside it. Marie-Louise was sitting on a sofa, with the child in her lap. Even this time she owed her privileged admission to the fact that she herself had brought the boy. Napoleon kissed his wife and his son. Then he said to the Empress, "Leave us now, my dear Louise. I'll send the boy back to you shortly." Marie-Louise left the room. Napoleon had his boy all to himself. He held him in his arms. "To work," he said to Nezelof, who was sitting as silent as a piece of furniture at a little table in a window recess. The secretary stood up and brought his master some documents to sign. Napoleon sat down in the hollow of his big mahogany desk, supported by gilded bronze griffins, whose shape, with its two rounded ends, suggested that of a violin. While he signed the documents, he held his son clasped to him with his free arm. The little king, astride his father's leg, sat quiet, but his hands were busy reaching for papers. He managed to get hold of one. The emperor gently opened his little fingers, took the document from him, and smoothed it out. Then he stood up. "Now I'll dictate to you," he snapped to Nezelof. For the next hour, shifting his son from one arm to the other, Napoleon strode up and down the room, dictating orders which, on the morrow, would turn the world upside down. The boy, holding on to one of his father's shoulder straps, or his cross of the Legion of Honor, kept quiet, drowned in the flood of words which passed over his head. Once an imprecation from Napoleon sounded like the snap of a man-eater's jaws. Then the child jumped. "Poor little man!" exclaimed Napoleon, comforting him with a kiss. All at once the emperor came to a standstill. Before he dictated any more orders, he must study a plan of battle more closely. He put his son down on the floor and opened a big mahogany box. Out of it he took pieces of wood of unequal size and different colors, representing respectively regiments, divisions, and army corps. He arranged them on the carpet in accordance with the inspiration of his military genius. Squatting on the floor, the little king took a deep interest in this spectacle. What lovely toys! Innocent little soul! He had no idea that the game in which they figured was a game of death. He came nearer, and his little fingers reached out friskily. Disaster overtook the French army. Napoleon started rearranging his pieces. The boy thought this was a fine game. He advanced into the middle of the battlefield, and this time nothing was left of the Russian army. Napoleon did not lose his temper. He began his maneuvering over again. More than once his patience was put to the test, but at last he could cry, "Victory!" It was the signal for playtime. Napoleon went down on all fours. The little king climbed on his back, and in this attitude Napoleon crawled all around the room. Then he stood up, and taking the boy in his arms again, showed him funny things in his study, a sliding shelf in his desk, an equestrian statue of Frederick II, a fine shade over a two-branched candlestick. But all this was nothing by comparison with the face-making show. Standing at a mirror, Napoleon screwed up his eyes, worked his nose up and down and sideways, pulled his mouth crooked, and stuck out his tongue. The boy laughed so much that Napoleon could see the back of his rosy throat reflected in the mirror. Down on the floor again, the king, under his father's indulgent eyes, was lord of all he surveyed. He found Napoleon's little black beaver hat lying on a chair. He picked it up and put it on his head, where it promptly sank down to his chin. This started him crying, and Napoleon had to come to his rescue. A few moments later he caught sight of Napoleon's sword, lying on the couch where his father had thrown it when he came in. How brightly it gleamed! How lovely it was! The boy's little hand reached out for it. "So soon?" cried the emperor. "Patience, sir, patience. You're a little too young yet." Despite himself, he shuddered at the sight of his son touching that weapon, whose mission was to kill. He felt that his son brought him closer to all humanity. This flesh of his flesh, whom he adored, reminded him that there were other fathers, other sons. Hitherto he had held them too cheaply. A few days earlier, the little king, who was only just beginning to toddle, had suddenly fallen, in Napoleon's presence, in the Empress's drawing-room. There were cries of horror from the spectators, echoed by the crying and sobbing of the boy, who had bumped his forehead against a piece of furniture. Madame de Montesquieu hurried to pick him up, and the ladies of the palace gathered round him. They comforted him, dried his eyes, blew his nose. Meanwhile Napoleon did not stir. He stood silently for some little time, with his head down. Then, coming out of his brown study, he said aloud, "I've seen one and the same cannon ball knock down a score in a row." Chapter 11. The Plume. It was not only the emperor who was proud of the King of Rome. The people of Paris seemed to transfer to the son the affection which they had devoted to the father before they developed their present coolness towards him. When the little king, with his escort of light cavalry, drove in his carriage to the Bois de Boulogne, or the Parc Monceau, cheers greeted him at every street corner. The populace are always responsive to good looks in their masters. They constitute an added element of attraction. The good looks, the winning ways of the King of Rome made the people of Paris enthusiastically fond of him. Everything he did assumed an air of legend. For example, Sergeant Cognet, thanks to his plume, became overnight the most famous and the most envied man in the whole empire. One morning, Cognet was mounting guard on the terrace of the chateau of St. Cloud. All at once he saw a group in the distance coming towards him. It was the King of Rome. Thrilled, the sergeant stood at attention. Madame de Montesquieu was carrying the boy, whose big rose-colored cloak hung down almost to the ground. Beside her walked his foster mother. Grand Marshal Duroc escorted the two women. Suddenly, as they passed the sergeant, standing stiff, as a post, but with mustache quivering with emotion, the little king gave vent to a cry like that of a bird. His little hand reached out towards the red plume on the sergeant's shako, which the wind had set ruffling. "What does he want?" asked his governess. "Why, the plume, of course," replied Duroc. He signed to the sergeant. "Come here, sergeant. Let him have his way." Cognet came forward and went down on one knee. Promptly his Majesty fell upon the plume, with both hands tearing it to pieces, and gurgling with delight. Madame de Montesquieu and his foster mother nearly split their sides laughing. "Madame," said Duroc to the governess, "give the prince to the sergeant, and let him carry him." Cognet nearly fainted. He stretched out his arms, took hold of the boy, and walked a pace or two with him. "Well," asked the Grand Marshal, "is he heavy?" "He is, sir." "Well, you're strong enough. Take him for a walk." The sergeant walked up and down the terrace. He clutched his emperor's son frantically to his breast, in dread all the time of stumbling over the flaps of his great coat and falling down. Meanwhile, drunk with delight, his Majesty pawed at what was left of the plume and flung the bits in the air, till he had his victim like a plucked chicken. Finally Duroc intervened. "That will do, sergeant. Give the prince back to the lady. Come to me in an hour, and I'll give you a requisition for 2 brand new plumes. You can keep one of them for Sundays. Dismiss my man." So the sergeant dismissed. When he told his superior officers what had happened to him, when he told them how he had carried the King of Rome in his arms for a quarter of an hour, he saw envy spring to life in the eyes of all around him. "You're lucky," they said to him. "That's the kind of thing one never forgets." Of all the people in the empire, Josephine was perhaps the one who most ardently desired to see the King of Rome. She had obtained Napoleon's permission to leave the chateau of Nevers in the Eure department, and she was back at Malmaison. Now that she was so near Paris, she kept asking Napoleon to let the little king be brought to her. Napoleon hesitated. He was afraid of making Marie-Louise jealous, but at length he agreed, on condition that the meeting take place with the greatest secrecy. It did so at the Dutch summer house at Bagatelle. Madame de Montesquieu brought the boy there from Paris, while Josephine came from Malmaison. At the sight of the boy, the ex-empress burst into tears. She took him on her lap, kissed him, went into ecstasies over him. "How handsome he is! How graceful he is!" She felt his plump arms and legs, and studied his features. "He'll be as strong-willed as his father." She didn't tire of gazing at him. It was as though some mysterious force had suddenly transformed her tears, her sobs, her sleepless nights, all her great grief as a repudiated wife, into this fine boy, whom life adorned with its surest hopes. With her bitterness mingled a strange pride. The empire's destiny was assured. Bonaparte was happy. The sacrifice to which she had agreed was not in vain. Madame de Montesquieu approached her. "Madame," she said, "we must take leave of your Majesty." Josephine started. She held the boy to her. "So soon? Let me have him for a little longer." Then, to amuse the boy and try and make him laugh, she played with him, and showed him a little monkey and some exotic birds, which she had brought with her. Rather shy, the little king stared in surprise at this unknown lady, already aging and using too much makeup, who pestered him with her vehement caresses. Finally, he could stay no longer. "Madame de Montesquieu," said Josephine, "I should like to have a portrait of him. I can assure you I shall always keep it with me." "I shall get one painted for you, madame," replied the governess. The ex-empress embraced the little king for the last time. With tears running down her cheeks again, she murmured, Ah, my dear child, some day you may know what you cost me." Chapter 12. Off for the Great Adventure. Napoleon had decided to open his campaign against Russia in the summer. Meanwhile, he invited all his allies, the German princes, the King of Prussia, and his father-in-law and mother-in-law, the Austrian Emperor and Empress, to meet him during the month of May at Dresden and attend his court there. Perhaps Russia, intimidated by all this parade of power, would draw back at the last moment. Before proceeding to Dresden, Napoleon made himself physically fit for campaigning. He had grown fat and flabby. He must remedy that. On March 30th, he betook himself with Marie-Louise to St. Cloud. There he hunted every day, galloping madly till he exhausted the strongest horses, even those stallions specially sent to him from America. The little king, who was unwell, stayed behind at the Elysee. He did not leave there until April 8th, when he went to Moudon. The anniversary of his birth passed unobserved, so far as official festivities were concerned, but he was given presents, a silver-mounted drum, his father's gift, of course, a humming top, a Polish lancer who performed exercises. His Aunt Caroline, the Queen of Naples, sent him a marvel of marvels, an enameled gold box, out of which, thanks to an ingenious mechanism, a little bird hopped to sing its song. Marie-Louise, for her part, made ready to accompany Napoleon, even though there was separation from him at the end of it. This journey delighted her. She regarded the empire as at the peak of its power, and the emperor as invincible. She imagined both of them to be unshakable. In her heart she rejoiced at the prospect not only of seeing her parents again, but also presenting them with the spectacle of her happiness, and the love with which Napoleon surrounded her, and dazzling them with the splendor of her court. The Emperor and the Empress of the French set off for Dresden on May 9th, 1812. On the day before, Napoleon said goodbye to his son. He took him in his arms and said to him, "Now say au revoir, say au revoir, Mama." Despite this kind encouragement, the boy simply stammered something unintelligible. "Lazy fellow," his father chided him. "At your age I was already fighting with Joseph." Then he gave his final instructions to Madame de Montesquieu. "Take good care of him, and write to me every day about him." In any case, Napoleon had taken all necessary measures for the King of Rome's safety. He had appointed a divisional general as governor of the palace at Moudon. For that matter, who in France would dare to raise a hand against the empire? Order reigned throughout it. The example made at Caen had been a salutary one, and no mistake. So the emperor felt entitled to withdraw all effective troops. From the four corners of the empire, soldiers flocked towards Russia. Little by little, France was emptied of all her young blood, like a heart squeezed to the last drop. Nobody was left behind but cripples. Everybody who could carry rifle and haversack footed it to the frontier. It was a long way, too. While his parents, escorted by a brilliant retinue, proceeded to Dresden by way of Chalons, Mons, and Frankfurt. The King of Rome led a quiet life at Moudon. At the beginning of June, he was weaned and suffered no ill effects. For the last few months, as a matter of fact, he had been having soup and broth. From now on he would be entitled every day to a substantial meal, with beef tea, entree, joint and sweet. Madame Achard's job was done. She went into glorious retirement, overwhelmed with pensions and presents. Napoleon heard the news at Königsberg. He wrote at once to his son's governess to congratulate her. Madame de Montesquieu deserved the emperor's esteem. She brought up the little king as though he were her own son. She provided against everything. As he was forever tumbling about, she had all the king's apartments at Tuileries, the Elysée, and St. Cloud padded up to his height. She took great care of his intellectual and religious education. She insisted that, as became his rank, he should always wear princely clothes, in which lace, plumes, gold, and silver were not spared. But she also thought about his father far away, so planned a surprise for his birthday. She summoned Mademoiselle Aimée Thibault, the famous miniaturist, and got her to make a miniature of the king, whom she represented sitting on a sheep. The miniature was entrusted to Monsieur Debonair de Giff, who maintained communications between the Council of Ministers and the Emperor's headquarters. Napoleon received it on August 3rd at Smolensk. No birthday present could have touched him more deeply. This miniature never left him. It was to be before his eyes at St. Helens, when death at length took pity on him. Meanwhile Napoleon kept his court at Dresden, amid a whirl of festivities. The Austrian emperor and kings and princes bowed down before him, rivaling one another in flattery and servility. But were they sincere? Napoleon suspected trickery behind their honeyed smiles. Above all, he wanted to win his mother-in-law over to his side. He was aware of her influence over her husband. He multiplied his overtures to her. He was assiduous in attentions. He wooed her, but most of all he counted on Marie-Louise's help. It was all in vain. In her body, as thin as a stick of asparagus, Marie Ludovica carried hatred of Napoleon bound up with her very life. Her stubborn, sullen soul was incapable of forgetting or forgiving. To no purpose did Marie-Louise give her the finest gowns from Leroy's, overwhelm her with jewelry and other presents. Maria Ludovica was not to be disarmed. The luxury with which her stepdaughter surrounded herself struck her as a personal insult. The sight of the 150 lackeys who attended the Empress of the French filled her with bile. It was an outrage for which sooner or later she would take her revenge. For that matter, grievances of which she made no secret were not lacking to make her include Marie-Louise in her execration of Bonaparte. Marie-Louise had become too French. She was too fond of her husband. She was betraying the cause of the Habsburgs. In fact, Marie-Louise had occasion to show how sincerely attached she was to Napoleon, for the hour of their separation had come. The Emperor took leave of her on May 29th, 1812, at 3 o'clock in the morning. It was a heart-rending scene. Marie-Louise wept and sobbed and clung to him. She vowed that she could never live without his dear presence. On July 18th, she was back at St. Cloud. There, a joyful surprise awaited her. The little king came to meet her with outstretched arms. He had 15 teeth, and he could run about, falling in all directions, but he could not yet talk. Marie-Louise resumed her life as empress. Napoleon had regulated her employment of her time, leaving nothing to chance or whim. Her sole real joys were the letters Napoleon sent her. They were short notes, hastily scribbled, and she could manage to make them out only with Madame de Montesquieu's help. But what mattered? A handwriting that would make the veriest schoolboy blush, when Napoleon put his heart into letters. On July 22nd, he wrote to Marie-Louise from Globocco, "My dear, I have received your letter of July 12th, and I see that you have had a little fever. You don't take enough care of yourself. I thank you for the news you give me about the little king. Everybody says that he is getting very strong and very greedy. As I write, you will have kissed him. That will have done you more good than anything else. Kiss him for me. Goodbye, my dearest dear. Love me always. All yours. Your Nap." Chapter 13. The Portrait. Napoleon and his army started crossing the Niemen on June 23rd. On the same day, Rostopchin, the governor of Moscow, wrote to the Tsar, "Your empire has two powerful defenders, its extent and its climate. At Moscow the Emperor of Russia will be formidable. At Kazan he will be terrible. At Tobolsk he will be invincible." For once a soldier was a sound prophet. Day by day Napoleon plunged a little further into the heart of Russia. So he went forward to meet his fate. On September 6th, with his telescope glued to his eye, the Emperor of the French was inspecting the ground on which he hoped to crush the enemy on the morrow. He was mounted on a prancing white Arab steed. Beside him was Berthier, his chief of staff. Behind him were Yvon, his surgeon, his orderly officer, entrusted with map, compass, and writing material, and Rustan, the Mamluk, who carried on his crupper in a valet, Napoleon's famous grey greatcoat. The Emperor studied the ground closely. Before him, in the background, he could see the shining course of the Moskowa, and in the foreground the village of Borodino, with the Gorky Plateau in the rear. Here the army corps of the Russian generals, Barclay and Bagration, were strongly entrenched, with their lines linked by fortified works, the Great Redoubt. Napoleon frowned thoughtfully. "That's going to be hard to take," he murmured. "It will cost me a lot of men." A page came up behind him. He turned round. "What is it?" "Sire, Monsieur de Bosset has just arrived from Paris." "I'll see him." A few moments later, the prefect of the palace bowed before his master. "Sire," he said, "here are dispatches for you, handed to me by Her Imperial Majesty." Napoleon grasped them eagerly. "Is that all?" he asked. "No, sire. I also have a packing case to hand over to you." "Very good," said the Emperor. "That will keep till later." "It contains a portrait, sire." At that word, Napoleon pricked up his ears. "A portrait? Whose portrait?" "A portrait of His Majesty, the King of Rome." "Why didn't you say so before, you fool? And where is it?" "On top of my carriage. It's so big, it wouldn't fit inside." Napoleon forgot everything else. Borodino, Bagration, the Great Redoubt. His one thought was to set eyes on his son's portrait. He turned to Berthier. "Well, go back, and you, Bossuet, fetch me this portrait." A few minutes later, Napoleon was in his tent, sitting on his iron bedstead with its green curtains. In front of him, Constant and Roustan, the Mameluke, made haste to open the packing case. Napoleon quivered with impatience. "You're no good for anything. You can't even take the nails out of a board." He was not far from lending a hand in person, but at length the gold frame of the portrait made its appearance. His son was before him. Gerard had represented the king in his cradle, playing with a cup and ball. Napoleon stared at the portrait intently. Emotion choked him. He could only repeat, "It's a wonderful portrait, wonderful." All at once he rushed out of his tent and shouted to the close group of generals who were awaiting his orders, come in, all of you." Ney, Devout, Nonsuti, Montbrun, and others hurried in on one another's heels. The emperor pointed to the portrait. "Look at that, gentlemen. I need not tell you that, if my son were 15, he would be here, not in a portrait, but in person. Come on, have a look at it. Isn't it fine?" He could not keep his delight to himself. He wanted everybody to share it. "Put it on a folding chair in front of my tent," he told Constant. "I want the whole army to see it. I want all my bearded veterans to see it." His valet did as he was told. But no sooner was the portrait outside, bathed in the soft light of the midday sun, than Napoleon shuddered. "No, no," he exclaimed, "bring it back. He's too young to look upon a battlefield." Napoleon was far from having exhausted his delight in this portrait of his son. In Moscow afterwards, pointing to it hanging in his bedchamber in the Kremlin, he said to Rapp, "My son is the finest boy in France." Meanwhile, he was eager to thank her who had sent him this portrait, which he was so delighted to see. "Meneval," he said, "give me a little sheet of pretty paper and a good pen. I really must write to my dear Louise about this." He took a gilt-edged sheet of paper and a goose quill and wrote, "My dearest dear, I am very tired. Bossuet has just delivered to me the portrait of the king. It is a masterpiece. I thank you so much for your thought of me. It is as beautiful as yourself. I shall write to you more fully tomorrow. Addio, mio bene. Nap." He folded the sheet of paper and handed it to Meneval. "Send that to the lady of my thoughts, the queen of my heart." Faithful to his promise, on September 8th, he wrote to Marie-Louise from the battlefield of Borodino. Upon it lay 40,000 dead, side by side with 30,000 wounded, most of them dying. Their cries filled the air. Quite naturally, Napoleon wrote, "Personally, I was in no danger at all. I am in the best of health. It is rather cold." Chapter 14. Disaster. It was indeed turning cold. From now on, it got colder and colder every day. On September 14th, Napoleon entered Moscow. He imagined he was at the end of his troubles. Alexander would surely admit himself beaten and sue for peace. But the Russians, as they retreated, had set fire to the city, and no peace proposals were forthcoming. Beside the ruins of Moscow, 3 quarters reduced to ashes, Napoleon waited in vain for a month for any overtures from Alexander. As time went on, he became anxious, but he let nothing of his anxiety appear in the letters which he wrote to the Empress. He talked to her as though she was a child. It was from Moscow on October 14th that he sent her this letter. My dear Louise, my greatest pleasure is to read your letters. It is the first thing I do when the express arrives. They are as charming as yourself. They depict your beautiful soul, and all your fine qualities are to be seen in them. You are perfect. I am in the best of health. We have had the first snow, but it is not cold. I do not think that I can come to Paris yet, and it is a very long way to fetch you to Poland. Embrace my son 3 times for me. Adieu, miao ben all yours. Nap. At length, Napoleon decided to retreat from Moscow. The retreat began on October 19th. Now the Russians witnessed the arrival of their best ally, General Winter. Ceaselessly harried by the Cossacks, decimated by the cold, short of food, short of transport, short of ambulances. Little by little the grand army dwindled, reduced to 50,000 men. Amid indescribable misery, it retraced the path which it had gloriously followed in the summer. The thermometer sank to 22 below zero. Every night thousands of men lay down, never to rise again. Of this disaster Napoleon did not breathe a word in his letters to Marie-Louise. My cause prospers, he wrote optimistically. I am on my way back to you. The grip of Kutuzov's Cossacks tightened more ferociously every day. Yet it was not from that Napoleon was dealt his hardest blow. It was from France. On November 6th, at Dorogoberg, 3 days' march from Smolensk, Count Daru presented himself. He was the bearer of urgent dispatches. Napoleon opened them. They contained startling news. In Paris, on October 23rd, a conspiracy hatched by General Mallet had all but overthrown his empire. Napoleon was overwhelmed. To be sure, it was something that Marie-Louise had not been affected by it. The truth had been carefully kept from her. She had been told that it was just a few unimportant mutineers who had made a bit of a row, and she had believed it. But the Emperor saw the matter in a different light. This affair bared before his eyes the fundamental defect in his system of government. It served to show that a handful of adventurers might suffice to ruin his whole achievement. In short, did not his whole empire depend on himself? If he died, would anything be left of his work? Why had nobody thought about his wife, about his son? In the old days, the death of the king was greeted by the words, "The king is dead. Long live the king." The monarchy went on like a flowing stream. Was the Napoleonic dynasty to be only a trickle of water, which any scoundrel could cut off to his own advantage? Was it only to this end that Napoleon had fought for 15 years? That he had repudiated the wife he loved? That he had married a daughter of the Habsburgs? That a son had been born to him? If Napoleon had listened only to the voice of his wrath, his impatience, he would have set off for Paris on the spot. But how could he desert his grand army in such straits, after the trials it had undergone for him? So he stayed with it, but he champed the bit of his impatience as he accompanied those few thousand of walking skeletons in rags in their painful progress across the white plains, on which the cold of the Cossacks laid deadly ambushes for them. Between the 26th and the 29th of November, what was left of the Grand Army crossed the Berezina. Finally, at Smorgoni, on December 5th, Napoleon handed over the command of his troops to Murat, and, together with Caulaincourt, flung himself into a sleigh. For some little time Marie-Louise had been depressed and listless. It was several days since she had heard from the Emperor. Around her she could detect growing disquiet and distrust. Her ladies were worried about husbands, sons, brothers. Alarming rumors circulated. Military bulletins were of no avail in reassuring public opinion. They were like damp squibs. The latest, that of December 7th, even gave a glimpse of disaster. On the night of December 18th, 1812, Marie-Louise went to bed feeling wretched. She was cold, and her loneliness weighed upon her. She had grown thin, and she slept badly. All at once she sat up in bed. What was that noise? Another insurrection. Had mutiny broken out again? At the door, the red woman who slept across the threshold had risen to her feet. With arms outspread, she was vainly trying to keep back a man as hairy as a bear. The intruder thrust her aside and hurried across the room towards Marie-Louise. He flung off his fur coat, his fur cap. "Napoleon, my dear Louise." He took her in his arms, pulled her out of bed, and proceeded to cover her with kisses. The red woman judged it unnecessary to await orders. She tiptoed out of the room. Chapter 15. At odds with the Pope. Napoleon's first concern after his return was to dismiss Frochot, the prefect of the Seine Department. 2 days after his arrival in Paris, he vehemently vented his spleen before the Senate. But it was no good crying over spilt milk. Above all, it was essential to see that the same thing should not happen again. What was the best way? Napoleon discovered it. It was to crown the King of Rome. Then, if Napoleon should happen to die, there would be no room for argument. His son would be there, crown on head, scepter in hand. There would be nothing to do but shout, "The Emperor is dead! Long live the Emperor!" But who could confer upon the coronation such luster, such prestige, such supreme authority, that all men would accept it without a murmur? Who could grant that divine right, which had constituted the strength of the late monarchy? Only God, or in default of him, his representative, the Pope. It so happened that Pope Pius VII was not far from Paris. In the course of the summer, he had been brought from Savoy to Fontainebleau, where he was more or less a prisoner. Napoleon did not disguise from himself the fact that negotiation with the Pope would be no easy matter. He had treated Christ Vicar pretty cavalierly. By simple decree he had annexed the patrimony of St. Peter to the Kingdom of Italy. At his orders, on July 6, 1809, Colnorodit had put the Master of the Vatican under arrest and escorted him to Genoa. Since then, Napoleon had kept the Pope on his travels, had him under his own eye, and paid no attention to his bulls of excommunication. All this, to be sure, was a bad start, but Napoleon had confidence in himself. He rushed the business. On January 19th, 1813, he arrived at Fontainebleau without warning, like a jack-in-the-box. He was accompanied by Marie-Louise, whose Christian sentiments were his best asset, and his whole court. For 5 days, alternately coaxing and threatening, Napoleon laid siege to His Holiness. He stroked him down, but in such a way that the iron hand could be felt under the velvet glove. He flattered the Pope. He lavished promises upon him. He was ready to make the greatest concessions to him. "But I am a prisoner," objected the Pope. Surely he must be joking. He was the Emperor's honored guest. By way of proof, the whole court were on their knees, disputing for the privilege of kissing the Pope's shoe and receiving his blessing. "Crown my son, Holy Father," the Emperor sang his siren song, "and I will give you back your throne, your states." Little by little, the old man let himself be won over. On January 25th, he signed a new Concordat. Napoleon returned to Paris in triumph. On February 1st, he communicated to the Privy Council a decree providing for a regency. He announced that the King of Rome's coronation would take place at Notre Dame on March 7th. But time went on without the Pope definitely making up his mind. For the Italian cardinals, the Black Cardinals were up in arms. In their turn, they besieged the Holy Father. They reproached him with being weak and committing himself to a mistaken policy. Once more the head of the church said Amen, and on March 24th he revoked his signature of the Concordat. Napoleon was bitterly disappointed, but he was not the man to let himself be worsted. What the church refused to him he would obtain from his people. Was there any finer crown on earth than that of popularity? The affection of millions of Frenchmen would serve just as well as the holy oil, if not better. But to win their affection, Napoleon must show himself to his people. He must cease to be a deity hidden in the depths of a tabernacle. So he dragged Marie-Louise all over Paris with him. Drives and visits to factories, workshops, and hospitals succeeded one another. At the Invalides, Napoleon got the Empress to taste the soldiers' soup, and introduced her 4 centurions, who were the pride of the place. As usual, Marie-Louise followed his lead shyly, sulkily. She never could find the right thing to do, the right thing to say, which would win all hearts. But Napoleon had more success with the King of Rome. Every day the people of Paris cheered the heir to their throne. As he drove along the boulevards to the Bois de Boulogne, blowing kisses to the passers-by all along the route. On one occasion wearing a great coat of nacarat velvet trimmed with chinchilla, and a cap of the same fur, the King of Rome attended a review of the guard by his father in the Place du Carrousel. The emperor took up on his horse, and lancers light cavalry, and dragoons cheered father and son as they marched past. The boy laughed and clapped his hands. With tears in his eyes, Napoleon exclaimed loudly enough for everybody within earshot to overhear him, "Look at him! He seems to know that all these fine fellows are my friends." Napoleon was proud of his son, and despite his busy life, his concern with his preparations for his fresh campaign, he still found time to pay attention to the boy. He loaded him with presents of trumpets, drums, and toy cannon. He continued to play with the boy too. Madame de Montesquieu brought him to Napoleon at meal times. Napoleon teased him, but by now the boy showed a character of his own. He pouted or flew into a temper, and if he was refused something he wanted, he stamped his foot and cried, "But I want it," for he had cut all his teeth and he was beginning to talk. One day his father offered him a mouthful of mutton, but just as his red lips were about to close on it, the emperor took it out of his reach. He did this several times. Finally the boy expressed disgust. Napoleon was surprised. "He's like that," said Madame de Montesquieu. "He can't stand being fooled. He's proud and sensitive." "Ah," exclaimed the emperor, giving his son a kiss, "that's just what I want him to be." April 11th, 1813, was a memorable date for the King of Rome. It was the first time His Majesty wore breeches, blue kerseymere breeches. Napoleon was delighted with him. "He's a real little man," he cried. Ah, why wasn't he really a man whom Napoleon could take with him, a second self who could aid him in the heavy task ahead of him? For Napoleon's departure was at hand. On April 15th, the emperor left St. Cloud at 4 o'clock in the morning to take command of his army. A fresh campaign was about to begin. Marie-Louise had been appointed regent and would rule the empire during Napoleon's absence.